Dr. Bruce McNabb. I am a One Health epidemiologist studying diseases in populations of both animals and people. In this video, I want to discuss the factors affecting the spread of contagious infectious diseases within populations. More specifically, I'll be focusing on respiratory diseases caused by viruses, which are spread primarily by coughing and sneezing out live viruses, thus contaminating other people and surfaces, either directly or indirectly when other people touch those contaminated surfaces, contaminate their hands, and then touch their faces or mucous membranes to become infected. Examples include the common cold, influenza, and coronavirus. Given that this is being produced in late April of 2020, people are most interested in COVID-19 caused by SARS-CoV-2, a coronavirus. Imagine you have a cold and you give your cold to two other people by either sneezing on them or sneezing on a surface, coughing into your hand and then shaking hands with that person, and that person gets their hand infected and they then touch their face. Well, imagine then each of those two people then go on to give their cold to two more people. You can see how this leads to an exponential spread of disease. More specifically, you can see in the schematic diagram that if you're at the top and you give your disease or cold to two more people, then each of those go on to give it to two more people again, leading to 4 new infections in their next round. And then the next round, 2 more per infected, leading to 8. And the next round, leading to 16 new infections, for a grand total of 31 infections, including you as the original infection. This illustrates the exponential spread of disease, where each step along the way increases by a factor of R, in this case 2 new infections per existing case, to the power of the generation that it is beyond the initial case. So you can see that exponentially positive impact you have by giving your cold to only one person instead of 2. You effectively cut off an entire exponential branch of the spread. Now, it's true that those people down the line can be infected by other people, but you can see the exponentially positive impact you have by reducing the number of new cases you create. Now, during COVID-19, you've probably heard the media referring to R, which is the reproductive ratio, or the average number of new cases produced per existing case as it spreads through a population. Now, this R statistic is extremely useful for public health officials and epidemiologists. So they calculate it by looking at various things as this disease spreads through a population, such as the doubling time, or K in this equation, and things like the number of days it takes for the number of counts to double in the population, and the number of days they think people are infected before they begin to shed the virus, and the number of days that they actually shed the virus. So they're basically back calculating, estimating the R in the population. Now, that's of use to epidemiologists, but difficult for regular citizens to relate to, something like that at the population level. So I'm going to bring it down to the personal level and talk about a concept I call your personal R, or how many new cases do you produce, and how can you reduce the number of cases you produce. So let's look at the factors affecting the spread of disease, or more specifically, the factors affecting how many new cases you create as an infectious person. So as an infected person, you are infectious, or actually shedding the virus, for a certain number of days. Let's arbitrarily set that at 5 days you are shedding the virus. Then let's look at how many contacts you make per day during those 5 days in which you might transfer the virus to someone else. Let's pick that at 5 contacts per day. So then per contact, what's the probability of transmission? How directly did you sneeze on them, or how soon did they touch the doorknob that you contaminated, So what's the probability of transmission to those contacts? Let's say that's 20%. So then of those, what's the probability they're susceptible? Let's say 60% of the population are already immune to the cold you're spreading. So that means 40% or 0.4 are susceptible. So then when you multiply that through, you're infectious for 5 days times 5 contacts per day, that's 25 people you might spread it to, times the probability of transmission per contact, well, that's 5 people you actually spread it to, gave the virus, but only 40% of those are susceptible. So you actually created 2 new infections, or an R of 2. How many new infections did you create, or what's your personal R, and how can you influence that? So let's come back to this schematic of exponential spread through a population. We've just seen in the previous slide how factors affecting how many cases you produce, and the example came out to you producing 2 new cases, or an R of 2. Well, now imagine everyone else in the population behaves similarly to you, so that on average, each of those people, when they become infected, create 2 new cases. What happens then through the population in terms of the number of cases, the number of hospitalizations, and the number of deaths? So what happens to the counts if we go out 10 generations, where R is consistently 2 in that each infected person creates 2 new cases? Well, when we get to the 10th generation, we have 2 to the 10, or 1,024 new cases created just in that generation alone. And the total, 2047, is the sum of the number of cases created at each generation, where at each generation, the number of cases created is R raised to the power of that generation number. So we have 2,047 people infected 10 generations out. So let's say 10% of those require hospitalization, are sick enough to require hospitalization or maybe even intensive care. So we need 205 beds for those 205 people. And let's say the disease is lethal enough that 1% of the people infected die. So that means we get about 20 deaths of those 2,047 people infected. And that's about 10% of those requiring hospitalization. So this example leads to 247 people infected, 205 people hospitalized, and 20 deaths 10 generations out when the R is 2. So in the previous example, each person in the population was infectious, shedding the virus for an average of 5 days. And during those 5 days, they made 5 contacts per day. And the probability of a transmission per contact, we said, was 20%. And we said 60% of the population were already immune to that cold, or perhaps even influenza through cross immunity to past vaccination and infection with influenza. So it said 40% were susceptible, we'll say, to this cold again. When you multiply that through, we get an R of 2 new cases produced per existing case on average. And that 10 generations out, that creates 2,047 infected people or cases, and at 10% hospitalization, 205 hospitalized, and at 1% death among those infected, 20 deaths. So in the previous example, we had a cold where 60% of the population were already immune to that. What happens if you introduce a brand new virus or bug where nobody has immunity to it? Let's keep everything else the same, where for this new bug, you're infectious or shedding for 5 days, and you make 5 contacts per day you're shedding, and we'll keep the probability of transmission the same at 20%. But now nobody's immune, so 100% are susceptible. That multiplies through to an R of 5 rather than 2. And that, in turn, because of exponential growth, 10 generations out creates 12,200,000 new infections or cases. And at 10% hospitalized, that's 1.2 million hospitalized. And at 1% death among those infected, that's 122,000 deaths, all because of this new R of 5, all because nobody's immune to it. So that R, when nobody is immune to it, is referred to as R naught, or R sub-zero, meaning at time zero, how many new cases are created per existing case. In this case, given the fact that nobody's immune to it. So in the previous example, we had a brand new bug appearing in a population to which no one had immunity. What happens if we get that immunity up to 80% through, say, vaccination or a combination of vaccination and immunity among those who were infected but did not die? Let's leave everything else the same, where days you're shedding the virus is still 5 days per infection, and you still make 5 contacts per day that you're infectious, and still a probability of 20% of transmitting the virus per contact. But now the probability of being susceptible is 20% because 80% are immune through vaccination or previous infection. That gives us an R of 1. So once you get it up to 80%, you have an R of 1. And from there on, you're getting the 10 generations after that point. Per case, you're getting 11 new cases with 1 hospitalized and no deaths. This level of immunity, percent immunity among the population, where R is 1, is a critical level. It's often referred to as herd immunity. And before we had vaccines, diseases would burn out once enough of the population became immune, having had the virus and survived and built up immunity. And when a sufficient proportion of the population get immune, then it burns out once the R, or number of new cases per existing case, drops below 1. Now, before we had vaccines, that's what we had to do. Now, with vaccines, the goal is to try to get immunity within the population up by vaccination and by natural immunity from infection to that critical point where the disease then burns out in the population because R becomes less than 1. In the previous example, we got the herd immunity up to 80% through vaccination and natural immunity, which was the magical threshold that made the R, or number of new cases per existing case, equal to 1. Now, let's go back to the beginning of the outbreak, where there was 0 immunity to the new infection. But now, let's decrease the number of contacts from 5 to 4. We'll leave the days infectious at 5 as before, but we'll reduce the contacts per day by 1 from 5 down to 4. And we'll leave the probability of transmission at 20%, where it's been all along. And the probability susceptible is still 100% because 0 are immune to this new bug. And that reduces the R down to 4 from the original 5. Resulting in about 1.4 million infections, down from the original 12 million infections 10 generations out, and decrease in hospitalizations down to about 140,000, and deaths down to about 14,000 from the original 122,000. That's a huge benefit, a huge gain, with only a pretty small change in behavior, reducing the number of contacts per day by 20% and getting a 90% decrease in the number of cases and deaths. This is extremely important illustration of the exponential impact of relatively small changes. In the previous example, we saw how just by decreasing the number of contacts per day from 5 to 4 in a population with a new disease where there's 0 immunity, we dropped the number of cases from over 12 million to about 1.4 million. That's a huge impact by just changing one factor. Now let's change some additional factors. First, starting with days available as infectious or shedding the bug. Imagine you stay home as soon as you show any signs of illness. Now, you were probably shedding before you showed signs of illness, but if you stayed home as soon as you showed signs of illness, you maybe cut 1 day off from 5 to 4 that you are available as shedding the bug to then spread it. So then let's also reduce the number of contacts per day down to 4, as we did in the previous example. Keep that down to 4. And then by washing our hands, coughing into our sleeves, social distancing, we reduce the probability of transmission per contact down to 10% from the previous 20%. Now, we still have zero immunity in the population, 100% susceptible, but by making those 3 changes, we now drop the R from the original 5 down to 1.6 on average new cases per existing case. And when you multiply that through, we get the following. We get total of 292 infections or cases 10 generations out. That's down from the original 12 million just by changing our behavior. And at 10% hospitalization, we reduce the number of hospitalizations out to 29 hospitalized, and at 1% death, we get 3 deaths. That's down from the original 122,000 deaths just by staying home when you're sick to reduce the number of days you are available to make contacts when you're spreading or shedding the virus, and reducing the number of contacts you make per day when you are out, and reducing the probability of transmission per contact by things like frequently washing your hands, coughing into your elbow, disinfecting, keeping it 6 feet apart, that type of thing. Even when everybody's susceptible, you greatly reduce the R. And remember, early on in a new disease, those are the only tools we have to decrease R, to decrease spread. We need to do that to so-called flatten the curve, to buy time until we have a vaccine that we can then get the herd immunity up through vaccination to a critical level, and then have people go back to more regular behavior. So we saw in the previous slide that by changing behavior among a sufficient number of people in the population, we can buy time, slow down the outbreak. So we buy time to perhaps get more immunity up in the population, maybe get a vaccine developed, and maybe improve our treatment of people who are ill. But that often has severe impacts on the economy. So how can we balance the number of deaths caused by the new disease against the number of deaths caused by poverty? How do we get to a new balance, a new normal, maybe with better treatment? What would that look like? So we could start off, maybe maintain the days available infectious at 4, where we encourage people to stay home as soon as they show any signs of illness. Keep that component. We let the number of contacts per day go back up to the original 5, letting people go back to work, letting them move around as much as they did before. Decrease the probability of transmission down to maybe 15% from the original 20% through hand washing, etc. That's not as good as when we were trying really hard and got it down to 10%, but it might be livable. And then say we get immunity up to 60% through a combination of vaccination and natural immunity, so it's 40% susceptible. That gives us an R of 1.2, leading to 10 generations out, 32 cases, 3 hospitalizations. And if we improve treatment so that we reduce the probability of death from the previous 1% to 0.8%, then in this situation, we get no deaths, down from the original 122,000. So that might be something that a new normal could look like when we get better treatment and increase the immunity within the population and let the economy pick up again. In the previous example, we got things under control by getting the R down to 1.2, which is greater than 1, but given the low mortality and improvements in treatment, by getting the R down to 1 through things like improving immunity and staying at home when you're sick and that type of thing, we got it down to a manageable level and got the economy running. But what if, instead of a 1% mortality, the new bug has a 95% mortality among those infected? Now let's keep everything the same as when we got things under control previously, the R down to 1.2, okay? Now add an R down to 1.2, the number of infections and deaths after you get the R down to 1.2, 10 generations out, is 32 cases, but 32 hospitalized and 31 deaths because their mortality rate is 95%. But that's at an R 1.2. Originally, the R was 5. And at 5, when it first started, with no immunity in the population, a mere 10 generations, viral generations out from that start, we had 12 million infected, and at a 95% mortality rate would have 11.4 million deaths. Okay. Now, when a new virus is discovered, we have unexplained deaths, and it takes us a while to figure out that those unexplained deaths are actually related to, and at least in part, caused by a virus we've never seen before. We isolate this virus, and it's different than anything on record, to which we are pretty sure very few, if any, people on the globe have immunity. Um, but we don't yet know what the mortality rate. We know we have a certain number of deaths, but it takes time to find the virus, develop a test for it, get the tests out there to see how many people were infected. What's the denominator of the mortality rate? We have the numerator, the number of deaths, but we need to find out what the denominator is to figure out if it's a 1% mortality rate or a 95% mortality rate. But we know the R is 5, and we know it's spreading like wildfire, and we know given air transport easily within 10 generations, which depending on the disease could be as few as 3 months or something. It can be and will be seeded, spread around the entire globe, and then subsequently people start dying, and a high proportion of those die that were infected. This isn't science fiction. This happens all the time in nature. Many of the gazillions of species that have gone extinct since the beginning of time, many of them went extinct because they got infected with some new bug that to which they were not immune. Even humans have been decimated but not made extinct by various disease outbreaks. And as an example, in the 16th century, Europeans inadvertently brought pathogens for diseases like tuberculosis, smallpox, influenza to the Americas. And indigenous peoples of the Americas were not immune to those new viruses and bacteria. As a result, their populations were decimated by disease, almost to the point of extinction. That's why public health officials responsible for populations that have little or no immunity to a new bug freak out when a new bug appears in their population. It's very dangerous. So if the new disease has a very high mortality rate, then you have to work very hard to get the R down as low as you can, as quickly as you can, and eventually hopefully get it below 1 so it burns out in your population. So if you had our initial conditions with average number of days a person that is infected actually sheds the virus is 5 days, and they make 5 contacts per day, and the probability of transmission is 20%, but because nobody's immune, the proportion that are susceptible is 100%, then after just 10 sort of steps or generations out, which again, depending on the disease, that could be different length of time. That might be in the range of 4 months from the beginning or something like that. You would get at an R of 5 and 95% mortality, 11.4 million deaths over that time because of the high mortality rate. So you need to get the R down as quickly as possible. It will take time to get a vaccine. So by reducing the average number of days that people are available while they're shedding down to say 3.5 through a combination of getting people to stay home definitely when they're sick or when they've had contacts with other people who had the virus, or just getting people to stay in place in general, but still essential workers out there and grocery stores and all that. you might get the average number of days that people are, while shedding, are available to have contacts down to 3.5 days. And then say you really shut down the economy and really just essential people working and cut down on movements in general. So you get the number of contacts per day down to 3.5. People really practice social distancing, washing their hands, and disinfecting and all that stuff. So they get the probability of transmission down to 0.1. But we still have no vaccines, so there may be some cases who survive. The 5% that survive are immune, but essentially the proportion susceptible in the population is still around 100%. Well, that multiplies through to an R of 1.2. So you got it down from 5 to 1.2. That's really good. And when that will take time to get that down. And when you get it down to 1.2, then after that point, you'll be getting in the range at 35 deaths per case that was active at the time you got it down to 1.2. You're not starting from one case anymore. You're now starting from multiple cases. So there'd actually be more deaths than that, but you've dropped it down quite a lot through restrictions to behavior, movement restrictions, business restrictions, to buy time to develop a vaccine. Well, let's say you do get a vaccine developed and you want to get things back to semi-normal or the new normal with this disease that has a very high mortality rate, in this case 95%. So once you get a vaccine in place and say 60% of the population vaccinated, so 40% are susceptible, then you can ease off on the other things, ease off on the staying at home, but maybe still encourage people to stay at home as soon as they show any signs of illness. So the days available as shedding or infectious is up to 4, not up to the original 5, but up from when we were really crunching down on movement. And the contacts per day is back up to 5, the normal rate. So people are moving around as normal before this all started. But we have changed behavior of the entire population so that we're all really careful about hygiene, washing our hands, change how close we stand together as automatic or new normal, and so that we keep the probability of transmission down to 10%. But because of vaccination, only 40% are susceptible. And that gives us an R of less than 1, gets us down to an R of 0.8. And once you get it down that low and be less than 1, then in this situation with a 95% mortality, the subsequent 10 weeks after you get it down to 1 or 0.8, you'd have 4 deaths. Again, you're not starting from just one case. You've got multiple cases out there at the time you get it down to the R down to 0.8. So it would actually be more than that. But eventually it would burn out. And once it burned out, then say you had maintained your R at 0.8 in the population in your country, and someone, and it had burned out, then someone flies into your country who was infected, and upon arrival is into a population that has an R of 0.8 for that disease, reintroduces the infection, but it burns out quickly, and in that case might only cause a total of 4 deaths, because upon reintroduction, the situation was such that the R was less than 1 and it burns out very quickly. So some comments and take-home messages from all this. The first thing is, do not focus on the specific numbers used for different factors affecting disease or the specific outputs from these. Rather, focus on the sensitivity of the entire system and the exponential impacts one can have, either positive or negative, by if we all work together to change something even slightly, such as if on average, if we can reduce the number of contacts per day by even a small amount, we can have over time a huge impact in the reduction of the total number of infections and deaths and spread them out over time. That's the take home message. Also, appreciate then that lack of information or knowledge about inputs such as the mortality rate greatly influence our perception of the disease. Slowing the spread, changing behavior such as staying at home when sick, reducing contacts, and probability of transmission all help to flatten or spread out the epidemic curve over time, both helping to keep illness within the capacity of the healthcare system and by buying time to develop new vaccines and improve treatments. New diseases will continue to appear. Some will be worse than others. Balancing the negative impact of disease against the impact of disease control measures and the economy is extremely challenging. We must learn to accept these challenges and work together to minimize their negative impacts in a balanced manner. Yes, it is bloody complicated, confusing, and very painful. You may ask, why can I go to the grocery store but not the coffee shop? That's because overall, on average, we have to get the total number of contacts down. You have to have groceries. You can buy coffee at the grocery store. You don't have to get coffee at the coffee shop. Why is it okay for essential workers to have many contacts per day, but I have to try as hard as I can to reduce the number of contacts I have per day? Yes, it's true. Essential workers, such as grocery store clerks, do have more contacts per day than others. That's why we need to provide them with as much personal protective equipment as we can to reduce the probability of them becoming infected themselves and them spreading it further. That's also why, because they have so many contacts, we need you to reduce the number of contacts you have as much as possible so the overall average, including you and essential workers, is lower than before within the population. This approach seems to start with the assumption that I'm already infected and am almost deliberately spreading it, when, as far as I know, I'm not even infected. Yes, it's true. The best way you can prevent spread is by not getting it in the first place. If you don't have it, you can't spread it. That's why we need you to be careful, both not to get it and not to spread it. The problem is you don't necessarily know if you have it or not. So we need you to be careful all the time. I understand and accept the increased risk of this disease. So why can't I reopen my restaurant? And those customers who also choose to accept that risk can come back to the restaurant, and those customers who choose not to face that risk can stay home. Yes, I understand your concern, and if the risk were limited to those who accepted the risk, say something like skydiving, if you choose to accept that risk, then you are the only one impacted if something goes wrong. The problem is diseases spread exponentially. Um, Somebody gets infected by having increased movement, like going to a restaurant, then infects someone else at the grocery store who chose not to go to the restaurant. You are imposing your risk on that person. It would be analogous to skydiving accidents having an R of 2, and 2 weeks after you died from a skydiving accident, 2 non-skydivers dropped dead from blunt trauma. So why not just have shedders stay at home and the rest of us can go to work and carry on? Yes, that would be wonderful if we could achieve that. That is, identify those people who are shedding and distinguish them for those who are not shedding. And to a certain extent, staying home while you're sick achieves that to a certain extent. But it's not unusual for viruses to be shed by infected people possibly several days or a long time before they become clinically ill. They may never become clinically ill at all, but still be shedding. And in some diseases, You may shed intermittently, shed for a while and then stop and then shed again. So to achieve that um, sort of separating out people who shed, it implies basically we have to be testing everyone all the time. Have some sort of inexpensive test that each person applies to themselves at home every morning. And if they test positive, then they don't go to work and they stay home as long as they are testing positive for shedding the virus and wait for a day or two after they're testing negative that they're not shedding the virus, then go back to work. But they have to continue to test because they might start to shed again, depending on the disease. So it's not as simple as it sounds, and we do not yet have the technology to achieve that, but we will be, continue to work towards something like that. This all seems very imprecise to me. How do we know we're not overreacting and thus causing unnecessary harm to the economy, or underreacting and thus causing more deaths than we could have prevented? You're right, it is imprecise. We will probably overreact or underreact or a combination of both at times. It's unreasonable to expect that we can prevent all harm. When a new disease crops up to which very few or no people have immunity, it's going to hurt. We have to accept that. But this is all very painful both to health and the economy. Yes, it is. And it is 100% certain it will happen again at some time. The next one may be less painful in that maybe it's less lethal or harder to spread, has a lower R. That would be easier, but it also could be worse. Remember, for the first 30 years of AIDS, there was no treatment. It was a death sentence. Imagine if the AIDS virus, instead of being spread by sexual contact, was spread by the respiratory system, just by sneezing on someone. And someone could sneeze on you, and you wouldn't know for months that you were infected with AIDS, that you were merely spreading it by sneezing on others. And then you did find out you had it, and you knew you were sentenced to die maybe 4 to 6 months after that. That kind of pathogen would literally threaten the extinction of humanity. So cheer up, it could be worse. This has been a presentation on the factors affecting the spread of contagious infectious disease. I am Dr. Bruce McNabb, One Health epidemiologist. Thank you for your attention.